When people think of America's history with opioids, they usually think of the 20th century when drug companies downplayed the addictive qualities of their new wonder drugs and pushed them on unsuspecting patients. But did you know that this isn't where the problem began? In fact, America's first opioid crisis actually occurred over 150 years ago after an event so traumatic it is still referred to as the War Between the States, or simply the War of the Rebellion, otherwise known as the American Civil War. You see, the Civil War was not only a war about slavery, states' rights, and political parties. It was also a war about survival. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, with 620,000 soldiers being killed out of a total force of around 3 million. That is a death toll of around 21%, which is far higher than any other war in human history. And these numbers don't even account for the hundreds of thousands of civilians who also died during the war. And that's because the Civil War wasn't just about combat. It was also the bloodiest chapter in the history of public health, featuring disease outbreaks, medical experimentation, torture, amputations, and medical ignorance all on a massive scale. In the end, there were so many injuries and diseases to treat that America's medical system got overloaded. Luckily, there was a medicine available that could treat most problems, from pain to diarrhea to depression. There was only one major issue. This medicine was extremely addictive. Opiates had been used since ancient times. Opium is derived from the opium poppy and contains the substance morphine, which was isolated from opium in 1804 and was soon being used by doctors to treat everything from pain to respiratory issues. By the early 19th century, liquid opium mixed with alcohol and flavored with anise became popular as a treatment for coughs and was called laudanum. Laudanum was so popular, in fact, that it eventually came in a tincture form with different colored liquids that indicated the strength of the dose. And the most common form of opium during the Civil War was opium gum, also known as deodorized opium or simply gum, which was sold in small pieces that could be chewed or smoked. Now, while opium was known to be addictive, at the time little was known about how it affected the body. So it was considered to be a safe medicine as long as it was taken in moderation. What doctors didn't realize was that what constituted moderation varied from person to person, and there was no way to tell who would become addicted and who wouldn't. With the start of the Civil War, the demand for opium skyrocketed as the nation's best and brightest headed off to battle and were injured or killed. In 1861, Congress appropriated $10,000 to purchase supplies for Army hospitals, including opium. But this quickly proved insufficient and funding for medical supplies increased throughout the war. On the Union side, volunteer surgeons were given two options for pain management. They could give opium gum or morphine to their patients, or they could refer them to a hospital pharmacy where they would receive larger doses of liquid opium. Because opium gum was easy to carry around and administer, it was the preferred method of pain relief. But morphine injections were favored in hospitals where addicts could be more easily monitored. Soon, these medicines were being given to everyone from young boys to elderly men, regardless of whether they had addictions or not. But why were so many people taking opium? Well, the answer is simple: survival. To understand this, we need to look at the everyday reality of a Civil War soldier. The first thing you need to understand is that most soldiers weren't actually killed in battle. They were killed by disease, injury, or medical procedures. Gunshot wounds were often extremely brutal, causing massive tissue damage and bone fractures. And it wasn't uncommon for bullets to remain lodged inside a person's body, causing infections that would eventually kill them. Even if a soldier survived their initial wound, there was a good chance they would die from infection as a result of gangrene, which was caused by a lack of blood flow to a limb as a result of the trauma. Doctors didn't have antibiotics, so the only cure for gangrene was amputation. Being amputated without anesthesia was excruciatingly painful, but it was also very dangerous. The risk of infection was extremely high and many patients would die as a result of it. To deal with this, doctors would sometimes use opium or whiskey to knock their patients out before performing surgery, though this wasn't always successful and some patients were wide awake during the procedure. One patient described his experience as he recalled in his memoirs, "A sudden, severe pain shot through my whole frame. I bit on a handkerchief which was put in my mouth to prevent me from biting my tongue or lips. My teeth were clenched so tightly that the blood came around my mouth and fell upon the floor. At last, it seemed as if the hand holding the knife slipped. I heard the saw. I cried out and fainted." While operations were risky, they were sometimes necessary, especially for one particular ailment that plagued soldiers: diarrhea. Soldiers often contracted cholera and typhoid fever, both of which resulted in severe diarrhea. If left untreated, both diseases could kill a person within days. The only cure was opium. In some cases, soldiers would take up to 14 grains of opium daily to stop suffering from the disease. After taking such a high dose, it was highly likely that a soldier would become addicted to opium. But as long as they kept taking it, they would survive. Unfortunately, if a soldier ran out of opium, their diarrhea would return and they would likely die anyway. This wasn't the only reason soldiers took opium, however. There were so many wounded soldiers that opium-based painkillers were sometimes the only way to keep up with the demand. This was especially true for those who were mentally scarred by the conflict. Soldiers who suffered from what we today call PTSD would self-medicate with opium to help them sleep at night. Soon, opium had gone from being a treatment for certain ailments to a way of life for many soldiers. Addicts would dream of returning home, then wake up and immediately reach for their pipe or chew on opium gum to get their fix. While it was originally thought that opium was non-addictive, by 1866, it was clear that this was not true. Drive, John H. Woodman, a surgeon for the United States Marine Hospital Service, estimated that between 1861 and 1865, 25% of Union soldiers admitted to hospitals for treatment were addicted to opium. Unfortunately, once a soldier became addicted, it was difficult to kick the habit. While the U.S. Army did try to treat addiction by switching addicts to less harmful substances like morphine, this proved unsuccessful as soldiers quickly developed a dependence on morphine as well. As the war drew to a close, the demand for opium began to decrease as fewer and fewer soldiers needed treatment. However, this created a whole new problem. Now that the war was over, former soldiers everywhere were withdrawing from opium and desperately seeking their next fix. It was estimated that between 1865 and 1867, 375,000 former soldiers were addicted to opium. Sadly, there was no real treatment for opium addiction at the time, and most addicts simply suffered until their addictions passed. Others tried to replace their opium habits with alcohol or tobacco, which created a whole new set of problems. The opium epidemic swept across the nation and even made its way into the White House. President Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, developed an addiction to opium while serving as his father's military secretary and traveled everywhere with his opium pipe. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Robert was unable to attend his father's funeral due to his addiction. Even after the epidemic ended, Americans were left with a newfound appreciation for just how powerful opium was and how easily a person could become addicted to it. The effects of opium would continue to be studied for decades to come, and it would eventually lead to the creation of modern pain management systems. But that doesn't mean that the problem went away. After all, America's first war on drugs began in the early 20th century and was aimed at Mexican immigrants and African Americans. And the deadliest drug epidemic in American history has been going on since the late 1990s and shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Clearly, the United States has a long history with addiction, and there is no end in sight. So do you think the Civil War was the worst time in American history? Let me know your thoughts. Also, thank you very much for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. It's no secret that we Americans have a love-hate relationship with opioids. You might think that this is a relatively new phenomenon. After all, it was only in 1996 that the FDA approved the incredibly addictive painkiller Oxy, a drug whose marketing campaign allegedly downplayed its risk of addiction. And it was only in 2007 that the CDC reported more than 14,000 deaths caused by an overdose of prescription painkillers. But our complicated relationship with these drugs actually stretches back much further. In fact, you could argue that it began all the way back in the 1800s during the Civil War. Physicians prescribed these drugs extensively both on the battlefield and afterward. And the war itself led to some major innovations in medical science. For example, it was during the Civil War that morphine injections were introduced. Today, most people take it for granted that they can get N4 of morphine if they were having surgery or giving birth. But before the Civil War, a patient who needed morphine would have had to smoke it through a pipe or drink it in a tincture. And the introduction of the hypodermic needle fundamentally changed how doctors dosed out the drug. Soldiers could now receive small doses of morphine quickly and easily without the need for smoking or drinking, meaning they didn't have to get high on morphine to feel its effects. But even though morphine was extremely popular, especially after the introduction of the hypodermic needle, it wasn't the only opioid soldiers were given. It was just one of several drugs physicians used to treat everything from toothaches to diarrhea, which was a problem that killed many more soldiers than combat did. In other words, it was a deadly threat that everyone had to contend with, whether they were fighting in the trenches or at home recovering from their wounds. Diarrhea was a huge problem for the Union Army, killing 31% of its men. By the end of the war, an estimated 70,000 soldiers had died from it. And while diarrhea usually isn't fatal, it can become dangerous if it lasts for days or weeks. The body needs water to function properly, and too much diarrhea can quickly lead to dehydration. Diarrhea can also cause the body to lose vital nutrients, including sodium and potassium. This can disrupt the body's delicate internal balance and cause serious problems with the heart and other organs. And the Civil War was the perfect breeding ground for diarrhea. Not only did soldiers have to contend with bad sanitation, but they were also frequently exposed to contaminated water. Many times this was due to their own waste contaminating their drinking supply. After all, the 1800s were well before the invention of indoor plumbing, and public restrooms were few and far between. So soldiers often relieved themselves wherever they happened to be. Needless to say, this meant that many of them weren't exactly careful when they chose a spot to do their business. Things were even worse for the Confederate Army, who often lacked basic supplies like food, clean water, and medicine. In his book, A More Perfect Union, author John Philip Schenck describes the situation facing Confederate soldiers. He says, in the summer of 1863, a Virginia soldier wrote home that he and his comrades had drunk water that had been mixed with the washings from the old woolen blankets and the filth of camp. Soldiers of both armies drank water from streams that flowed past latrines. The lack of proper sanitation also meant that diseases like cholera and typhoid fever ran rampant, causing even more diarrhea and death. The problem got so bad that William Hammond, the Surgeon General of the Confederacy, issued a pamphlet to try to teach his troops how to avoid getting sick. He instructed them to boil their drinking water and bury human excrement at least 2 feet under the ground. But we don't have to take Hammond's word for it. We can also look at letters written by soldiers to get a sense of what life was like during the Civil War. A letter written by a Confederate soldier named James Power to his wife vividly illustrates the insanitary conditions soldiers had to deal with. He writes, "We are living in our tents and we have to cook our own rations and wash our own clothes and do our own everything. There is no houses or hotels here for miles around. In fact, there is nothing but woods and a large river. We have to get along the best we can, and we are having to get along pretty rough, hard, tack, and very little of it. But we get along." He also mentions that there's already some sickness going around camp, but he doesn't specify what kind. In another letter written by a Union soldier named Ira Oglesby to his mother, he describes the insanitary conditions plaguing his camp. He writes, "Our regiment is encamped on a branch of the Potomac near a ford. All the Potomac water is brought here. Soldiers bathe, wash clothes, drink, and cook with it. It is almost night, and there is a fog hanging over the river like a pall over a grave. In such places as this, disease has quite an advantage." Oglesby wasn't wrong about that. Disease was able to run rampant in these insanitary conditions. And diarrhea was especially prevalent, killing thousands of soldiers. Soldiers who suffered from diarrhea often found themselves in the hospital. And once they got there, doctors would prescribe them opium. Opium comes from the opium poppy plant, which is related to the plants that produce drugs like morphine and heroin. Opium has been used for centuries to treat pain and is still sometimes prescribed today to patients in hospice care. But opium isn't as fast-acting as morphine, meaning it wasn't the ideal drug to use on the battlefield. On top of that, it made patients feel drowsy and nauseous, which is why doctors typically reserved it for cases of severe diarrhea. When opium was administered, it was usually in the form of a tincture called laudanum. Laudanum consisted of opium mixed with alcohol and water. Since laudanum was already a liquid, it didn't need to be injected. Doctors could just pour it into a glass and have their patients drink it. Some recipes for laudanum called for more alcohol and less opium, while others did the opposite. But either way, the final product was potent enough to make a grown man fall asleep after just a few sips. Given that laudanum could knock someone out, it's not surprising that it was also habit-forming. In fact, it was so habit-forming that laudanum was sometimes called the liquid to which all other narcotics are compared. Another name for laudanum was soldier's delight, which is ironic considering that it was so dangerous. Doctors knew that the drug was addictive, but they prescribed it anyway. Today, we know that opium and morphine aren't the only two drugs that can stop diarrhea. There are plenty of modern medications that can do the job without the unwanted side effects. Unfortunately, these drugs hadn't been invented yet. And the doctors treating Civil War patients were working with what they had. Opium's success against diarrhea might have had something to do with the fact that it also caused constipation. And that's not a coincidence. Both morphine and opium are technically known as narcotic agonists. Agonists are drugs that bind to certain receptors in the body. When morphine or opium binds to these receptors, they send messages to the brain that can result in feelings of euphoria, drowsiness, and pain relief. They also suppress the central nervous system, meaning that they slow down the body's natural processes. This is how they can reduce diarrhea. But it's also why they have so many negative side effects, including constipation. Civil War soldiers who developed an addiction to opium or morphine were stuck in a sort of catch-22. They were addicted to the drugs because they were trying to stay healthy, and they needed those drugs to stay healthy. One soldier described the situation succinctly when he said, "I took morphine to cure me of cholera infantum, and that is what made me a morphine fiend." While opium was typically reserved for cases of severe diarrhea, morphine could be used for a whole host of ailments. During the Civil War, morphine was administered to treat everything from depression to tuberculosis to childbirth complications. But it was mostly used to treat pain, and doctors seemed willing to hand out the drug liberally. According to the Surgeon General of the Union Army, 12 million doses of morphine were distributed to soldiers between 1861 and 1865. That works out to around 14 doses for every man in uniform. At first glance, this might seem like a lot, but it was actually less than half of what was needed. The same Surgeon General reported that between 1861 and 1863 alone, the United States supplied over 26 million doses of morphine to the Union Army. Where did the rest go? Well, that's a little hard to say. But it's possible that the drugs ended up being used for non-medical purposes. After all, morphine is a powerful painkiller, and war is full of pain. Whether or not that's true, the amount of morphine being distributed reached such high levels that there simply wasn't enough for everyone who needed it. The Surgeon General noted that many times soldiers were forced to share needles, and that's probably where things got really bad. Sharing needles dramatically increased the risk of contracting deadly diseases like hepatitis and HIV. All of this raises an important question. Why was it that soldiers needed so much morphine? Why couldn't they just use opium for pain and save the morphine for cases of severe diarrhea? Well, part of the answer lies in the nature of the different drugs. As we've already mentioned, opium isn't as effective at treating pain as morphine, but it's also worth mentioning that opium produces fewer side effects than morphine, which is why doctors were more hesitant to prescribe it. By the end of the Civil War, over 300,000 veterans were receiving pensions for disabilities caused or worsened by their experience in the war. And many of them were receiving those pensions because of opium or morphine addictions they developed while in the military. Soldiers who returned home with these addictions often struggled to reintegrate into society, and their addictions often worsened their mental health problems. Despite the harm these drugs inflicted on soldiers, the American Medical Association resisted calls to regulate them. The AMA was founded in 1847, and for decades, it opposed government involvement in medicine. This included opposition to the co-regulation of opium and morphine. It wasn't until 1914 that the federal government passed the Harrison Narcotic Act, which required doctors to keep detailed records of their patients' drug consumption. As you can see, our complicated relationship with opioids goes back much further than most people realize. To learn more ways that the Civil War changed America, stay tuned for more information. If you've been following this series, you'll know that during the 19th century, the United States experienced two distinct opium epidemics. The first from over-the-counter opium and morphine self-medication in the early days of industrial capitalism. And then a second one after the 1898 Spanish-American War from military-prescribed morphine addiction. But if you're paying attention, you might be saying, wait a minute, we're not in the 1800s anymore. So how did we get from the end of the Second Opium War to the start of the 20th century? Well, let me tell you about the forgotten American opioid crisis that almost nobody knows about today. The American Civil War was one of the most traumatic events in American history, and its impact on public health is still being studied today. And as horrific as the war itself was, its aftermath would prove to be just as challenging. As the country grappled with issues like slavery, states' rights, and the meaning of freedom. It also had to deal with the aftermath of over 220,000 dead people and 500,000 wounded soldiers. It was during this time that the use of opioids really took off. In fact, it was so widespread that there was an epidemic of addiction among the veteran population. This opium epidemic among veterans created severe social and medical challenges, particularly since addiction was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized at the time. Soldiers returning home with morphine habits often found themselves shunned by society and abandoned by their families. This led to tragic outcomes, as addicted veterans sometimes lost their military pensions due to their addiction and were institutionalized in mental asylums. Doctors treating these veterans faced similar stigma. The medical community struggled with how to treat these patients without subjecting themselves to accusations of being unable to cure even the simplest of addictions. But it wasn't just veterans suffering from addiction either. In fact, many civilians were struggling with substance abuse as well. Morphine and other opioids were widely available in patent medicines, which were essentially over-the-counter drugs with a variety of supposed health benefits. And because they contained small amounts of opium or morphine, they quickly became habit-forming. The result was a widespread opioid epidemic that affected all levels of society. The Civil War had left a deep psychological wound on the nation. Many people turned to drugs to cope with the trauma of the war, whether they were veterans or civilians. The problem was so dire that it caused alarm not only among the general public but also among doctors who realized the gravity of the situation. Doctors began to see the damaging effects of uncontrolled opioid use firsthand and started advocating for more cautious prescribing practices. This marked a significant shift in the medical community's approach to pain management and addiction treatment. As the country grappled with the opioid epidemic, the medical community was forced to confront the issue of addiction head-on. Doctors recognized the need to treat those suffering from opioid addiction with compassion and understanding rather than judgment and stigma. This led to the development of new treatment approaches and a greater focus on preventive measures. In doing so, they laid the foundation for modern addiction treatment and helped reduce the stigma surrounding substance abuse. So what can we learn from this dark chapter in American history? The answer lies in understanding how we got here in the first place. So let's go back to the beginning. As I mentioned earlier, the use of opioids really took off during the Civil War. The conflict was one of the deadliest in American history, and soldiers on both sides were exposed to horrific injuries and trauma. To manage the pain and suffering caused by battle, medical professionals turned to morphine, an opiate derived from opium poppies. Morphine was seen as a miracle drug, capable of providing relief from even the most excruciating pain. However, what they didn't realize at the time was that morphine was highly addictive. And as the war dragged on and more soldiers were exposed to it, a severe morphine addiction epidemic began to emerge. As the war came to a close, hundreds of thousands of soldiers returned home with morphine habits. They struggled to reintegrate into civilian life while battling their addictions, which were poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. It was difficult for them to find work, maintain relationships, and lead normal lives. And if that wasn't bad enough, the government was actually contributing to the problem. Military pensions, which were intended to help soldiers transition back to civilian life, were often revoked when a pensioner was declared addicted to drugs. This meant that many veterans were left without financial support and turned back to the only thing that had brought them temporary relief. The problem was so dire that it became known as the morphine evil. This term encompassed not only the physical addiction, but also the social and economic consequences that followed those addicted to morphine. The sight of former soldiers, some as young as teenagers, wandering the streets in a daze, seeking their next fix was a heartbreaking and all too common occurrence. For doctors, treating these men presented a unique set of challenges. On one hand, they wanted to help alleviate their patients' suffering. But they also feared being associated with the growing stigma surrounding morphine addiction. If a doctor was seen as unable to cure even the simplest of addictions, their reputation could be ruined. This internal conflict within the medical community contributed to the slow recognition of the severity of the morphine evil. Despite the challenges, some doctors began to speak out. They called for a more compassionate and informed approach to treating those addicted to morphine. These voices, though initially few, would eventually grow louder and help pave the way for a better understanding of addiction and improved treatment options. Their advocacy marked the beginning of a long journey toward recognizing addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing. The Civil War had a profound impact on the American psyche. The nation was grappling with profound questions about loss, trauma, and healing. Amidst this turmoil, people turned to various means to cope with the emotional and psychological scars left by the conflict. Some found solace in religion, others in literature or art. And still, some sought refuge in drugs. In the midst of this societal struggle, doctors observed the growing number of civilians turning to drugs for comfort. At first, it was individual cases here and there, but soon it became a pattern. The easy availability of opioids and patent medicines made it simple for people to fall into the trap of addiction. The combination of grief, trauma, and readily available drugs created a perfect storm that led to a widespread opioid epidemic among civilians. Doctors witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of this epidemic. Families were torn apart as addiction took hold of their loved ones. Communities were shaken as the epidemic spread and people lost their jobs, their homes, and their dignity. The doctors realized that they were facing something far more complex than a simple drug problem. It was a public health crisis fueled by a multitude of factors, including societal trauma, economic hardship, and the lack of understanding about addiction. As they grappled with the complexities of the epidemic, doctors began to question the role of opioids in society. For years, these drugs had been seen as a miracle cure-all. But now they were witnessing the terrible consequences of that belief. This led to a growing movement among medical professionals to call for more responsible prescribing practices. They advocated for a shift away from the quick-fix mentality that had contributed to the epidemic. Instead, they pushed for a more holistic approach to medicine, one that took into account the physical, emotional, and social aspects of a patient's health. This movement was not without its challenges. The medical community was deeply entrenched in the belief that opioids were a safe and effective treatment option. But the doctors advocating for change were undeterred. They continued to speak out, sharing the stories of their patients and calling for a reevaluation of the status quo. Their efforts were a pivotal moment in the history of addiction treatment, marking the beginning of a move towards more humane and effective methods of helping those struggling with substance abuse. and the legacy of their work continues to resonate today. Today, we continue to grapple with the opioid epidemic, though its form has changed since the late 19th century. The wounds of the Civil War may have healed, but the scars remain, serving as a reminder of the importance of addressing the root causes of addiction and treating those who suffer from it with compassion and understanding. We must honor the legacy of the doctors who, in the face of adversity, stood up for a better way, a way that recognizes addiction not as a moral failing, but as a treatable illness. If you want to learn more about the opioid epidemic, I highly recommend checking out Sam Quinon's book Dreamland, The True Story of America's Most Addicted Generation. The book covers the rise and fall of the opioid epidemic in great detail and is very well written. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. Thanks for watching.